So the Scuderia Ferrari 430 is one of the latest cars in Gran Turismo 7, however we do have another version of this car with the F430 which has been around since the launch. So today I'm going to compare both the hardcore version and the original to see which one of these two absolute beautiful Italian stallions comes out on top. So when it comes to hardcore Ferraris, honestly the 430 Scuderia may just be one of the best in the business. So let's head over to the price. So let's first start off with a 430 Scuderia from 2007. In terms of its price point, it's not the cheapest, 380,000 credits, 617.08 pp, MR drivetrain, 502 brake horsepower, 1350 kilograms, and is naturally aspirated. Definitely not the cheapest, but in terms of specs, it's looking pretty decent so far. So how does it compare to the F430 that's been in the game since day one? Now in terms of the F430, this is the 2006 model, 599.36 pp. It's going to be a MR drivetrain once again, 495 brake horsepower this time around, and weighing a little bit extra at 1450. Once again, naturally aspirated. Price point 243,200. Now this is pretty typical of Ferrari when it comes to their hardcore models. So there's nothing really that different between either of these cars when it comes to the price point. No surprises there. However, where it does start getting different is with the 430 Scuderia. It does have similar customization options but does have more to it. Now in terms of the wide body, both cars do feature this option. However, it definitely means that you'll be putting on some extra modifications with the wheels just to kind of make it fit properly and suit. If not, you end up with a massive bunch of the wheel just tucked away under the arches, and it really just doesn't look quite right. As mentioned though, the Scuderia does have that extra option when it comes to the aero kits, so the likes of the front and the sides do feature extra options, and in terms of the wings, they're very similar. They all feature custom wing sets. However, with the Scuderia it's full carbon, whereas it isn't with the F430. Again, heading over to the F430, if you just want to make everything look correct, honestly you're going to have to change the wheels on this car so that they do poke out a little bit extra. If not, you end up with this really weird look on the standard wheels where it's completely tucked under and just doesn't look that great. Again, in terms of the wing, all color coded. So it's time to review both the standard and fully upgraded version of both cars. We'll have the 430 Scuderia up first. Of course, this is the latest addition to GT7, and like I mentioned, when it comes to hardcore Ferraris, nothing has been lost over time. This is simply put a very brutal car to drive, and definitely not a beginner friendly vehicle, that's for absolutely definite. Now I personally have over 2,000 hours into GT7, and I like to think I'm fairly comfortable with most cars in the game, whether that be road, race or rally. However, one thing I noticed when it came to the 430 Scuderia is the massive learning curve there. To get the most out of this car, you're going to need to be precise, you're going to need to be careful, and you're going to need to learn how this car works. Now honestly, some of the easier things to touch on are the likes of the acceleration, top speed, performance and all that good stuff. Really, they're absolutely fantastic, and it doesn't feel like this car is showing its age that much so far. However, what I do need to mention is just how incredibly hardcore and brutal that suspension is. It really is an incredibly stiff ride that's not very forgiving in the slightest. Another thing to mention is the gearbox itself. Again, I don't know if this is a glitch or it's meant to be with this car. It does seem that it does have a chance to miss the upshift or downshift. Really, it's quite a bizarre feeling, and it can be frustrating when it happens. But back to the suspension, that is where all of the key differences with the 430 Scuderia is felt over the F430. Honestly, it's definitely not the easiest car in the world to go with. If you try and go flat out straight away, I can guarantee this thing is going to tame you before you tame it. It really does give it that overall pretty brutal and pretty fantastic feeling. I honestly have no complaints with this car. It's quite nice to actually struggle with a car and be forced to learn everything about it to get the most out of it. And honestly, if you're that type of person, or you're a Gran Turismo driver that absolutely wants that driving feeling, then you can do much worse than the 430 Scuderia. It's an absolute hardcore brute. One thing that I do really enjoy is the fact that that hardcore feeling also takes place inside the cabin of this car. It's an extremely good looking interior and maybe up there as one of my entire favourites in GT7. Whether you're looking at the dash or seeing the engine out the back, this thing just looks fully carbon and really cool. So now it's time to talk about the F430, and this is where things get a little bit different and probably a bit more complicated than they actually need to be. Now of course this isn't the hardcore track day version, and it does very much feel like that. It certainly feels like a much more road going version. The driving height is much higher feeling than what we see with the Scuderia. The suspension moves around a lot more and it's a lot easier to get this thing kicking out and much more controllable than we see with the very much planted Scuderia version. However, I will admit that in terms of the driving style, this car feels much quicker overall, even if it really isn't. So one thing to definitely take note of, although this car does have that extra weight, you won't necessarily feel it at all times. It does still retain that very lightweight feeling that we see as well with the Scuderia. However, as mentioned, this car certainly does feel much more squirrely. You'll find that it's a lot easier to break traction. You'll find that you'll put the power down out of corners and all of a sudden you're in a power slide. However, because of the way this car's set up, it's very easy to maintain it and also catch it. I feel like the limits of this car are much easier to predict, and really that's the way it should be. But certainly in terms of the sense of speed, the F430 genuinely does feel quicker overall. It definitely feels like a car that you can attack a lot more less precise with and get away with some pretty ridiculous stuff, whereas the Scuderia will definitely probably try and punish you and more than likely come out on top rather than you. So if you want a beginner friendly version, honestly the F430 really isn't that bad, and it does serve as a very good starting point before you move into something like the F430 Scuderia, which is certainly the more hardcore of the two. Now in terms of the driving experience, every single bump can be felt in the F430, whereas the Scuderia is just going to constantly stay planted very low to the ground and very aggressive in the way that it's set up. I did also notice that the upshift on this car does have a slight chance to miss if you just get it wrong, but it's certainly not as prominent that we see with the Scuderia once again. So overall, honestly, if I had to choose one as a more beginner player that wants to get to grips with MR cars, you can do much worse than the F430. However, once you've gained that confidence, honestly, there's no excuse to ignore the 430 Scuderia. It definitely feels like the more complete package, especially straight out of the dealership. So with the performance covered, honestly, how does the F430 hold up now we have the Scuderia in game? And this is where I have to be honest. The 430 has never really been my most ideal Ferrari model. Honestly, it's one of those cars that's grown on me over time. But for me, the Scuderia is exactly what the F430 should have always been. There's just something quite weird about seeing everything colour coded and matching with very little to look at in terms of carbon on the outside, and really the same goes for the inside of this car as well. It just doesn't feel like something that's exactly racy. I get it's a much older vehicle now, but honestly it just feels far toned down in terms of Ferrari. Honestly, another thing that gets carried over is the interior as well. Without the whole carbon aggressive look inside, the 430 just looks like a very weird car, and not to mention that hideous tan interior. So heading over to the timing board, as expected, the 430 Scuderia is slightly quicker. Now there's not too much in terms of the PP difference, so 6:16 versus 5:99. Now in terms of the time, it was a 7:26.958 for the Scuderia, and the Ferrari F430 did it in a time of 7:32.964. So really not too much in it when it comes to a lap of the Nürburgring. However, where things may change is when it comes to running them both fully upgraded. So time to swap it around this time, we're going to have the F430 up first. So with the F430 up first, this is where we see a bit of a switch in how both cars handle their upgrades. Now in terms of the F430, I would actually say this time around with the upgrades on, it is the harder of the two to actually get tuned correctly. Now of course I can't do individual tunes when it comes to these videos for the fairness of the reviews. However, after going back to these builds after to try and build them up to certain specs, it is definitely more frustrating to get the F430 just right, unlike the Scuderia. I would also go on to say as well that this now becomes the harder of the two cars to actually drive overall. Maybe it's just because it does feature a few lack of upgrades, so in terms of, you know, some of the more major era, we do see that is completely absent from the F430, and that is possibly the reason that you can't go as extreme as you can with the Scuderia. But definitely in terms of the way it responds to the upgrades, it is probably the weaker of the two, and the one that is going to take more time to really wrap your head around and get that perfect build for your personal driving style. A much more frustrating car to drive overall, and definitely does feel a little bit on the jankier side than the Scuderia itself. However, is it a bad car overall? Absolutely not. And we, you know, can take into consideration the fact that the price point is massively different between the two. Honestly, if you want to go for a budget Scuderia and have performance that is, I guess, near enough to it, then honestly the F430 really isn't that bad. Just be prepared to spend a lot more time going around the fine tuning to get it suited towards you. What might work for me might not work for you, etc. And I do find that it is harder to wrap your head around the 430 than it is the Scuderia. However, it really isn't too far off the pace. It was a relatively clean lap overall, and it did feel like the car became more confident as well as myself as the lap went on. So how does it match up against the Scuderia? As that is going to be up now. So in terms of the Scuderia, we can instantly see that it just looks a lot more aggressive. It looks a lot more planted and a lot more confident out on track. So honestly, the Scuderia just serves one single purpose: to make the 430 as responsive on the track as possible, and this is certainly something we see when the upgrades are on. This car can pretty much handle everything. I would go on to say that this is perhaps one of the better road going MR cars once you start putting the upgrades on to take it to 700, 800 pp, etc. It feels absolutely fantastic, and it feels properly purpose built. Now when it actually comes to the car itself, as mentioned, the 430 does become the harder of the two to drive, and honestly that's just a credit to the Scuderia just being such a solid base foundation. I found myself having no issues at all when it comes to being confident with this car straight away. Honestly, is it the easiest car to tune in the world? Absolutely not, but this is something typical of GT7, where the MR cars are just a bit more fiddly than really anything else in game. Again, a lot of the impressive features of this car comes from the handling and the suspension and just overall responsiveness of the vehicle. Now when it comes to turning a road car into a GT4 or GT3, honestly the 430 Scuderia may just be one of the best in the entirety of GT7. It was made for the track and it still feels that way once the upgrades are on. The responsiveness of that engine and the way that it handles absolutely everything is almost perfect straight out of the gate. Again, doesn't require as much fine tuning as the F430, and it is credit to the way that the car is set up straight away by default. Honestly, it's fantastic. Again, it is a bit pricier, but I just think overall it is the better of the two in any shape or form, whether you want stock, upgraded. For me, the Scuderia may just be one of the best prancing horses in the entirety of GT7. So let's have a look how they compare when it comes to the lap time. Now in terms of the Scuderia, this is going to come third overall. In terms of the MR cars, this is a fairly impressive time, 774.01 pp, a 159.176, and in terms of the F430, that is going to be 750 pp, a 201.802. So slight difference there. Again, this is Suzuka, so a much shorter layout, but honestly the Scuderia is absolutely the king of the hill when it comes to these two. So honestly, when it comes to hardcore track day specials, I think it's going to be very difficult to beat the 430 Scuderia. In total honesty, I really wasn't expecting much in terms of the launch of this vehicle. I thought, okay, it'll be good, but it'll probably start showing its age very early. However, I'm happy to report this car has exceeded every single expectation, and when it comes to sheer difference between the F430 and the Scuderia, there really is a pretty substantial one. If you want a full-blown track car, then honestly it's going to be very difficult to beat the Scuderia. So I want to say a big thank you to everyone that watches this video, as well as all of my channel members. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Take care guys, peace.